yeah, graduated and then didn't want to think about, talk about, look at, engage with steampunk. Because, and that has nothing to do with steampunk, it has everything to do with a dissertation. You ask just about any grad student, when you finish writing something, researching something for 5, 6, 7 years, which was not the case for me. I apparently did it in record time, which was cool. Kids, a lot of the kids, it's my kids. If you don't applaud for me, you applaud for my kids. Go ahead, because they're great motivators. Dad, when are you going to be available to play with me? But I wanted to completely retreat from it. So I haven't talked about steampunk since I did that defense, since sitting in that room and having that engagement, aside from one lecture in my science fiction course this last semester. So it's been a while, so I might be a little bit rusty. But I want to recommend 10 steampunk reads to you guys today. And maybe this is a way of prepping you for possible panels or presentations that'll happen at Spec in the fall. But it might just be a way for me to line up some really great summer reading for you. Now, I must say at the very outset, this is by no means a best 10 or my favorite 10. But having done a blog now for coming up 5 years, where people want me to tell them what to read, I've tried to review books, not whether I think it stinks or is brilliant, but rather who will read this, right? Who would be interested in reading this? And in doing that over and over again, I've sort of crystallized a short list of books that over and over again I will recommend to people when they're saying, I just want to get into steampunk, what do you recommend? And I stopped doing something that I used to do, which is I would say, what do you read? Because quite often people are looking to get into steampunk to get away from whatever they normally read. So I had a guy on Twitter this last year asking me, like, what should I read? I said, well, what do you read? Chuck Palahniuk. And I'm like, wow, Fight Club, great. How do I recommend something steampunk to you? And he said, I don't really want you to recommend the Chuck Palahniuk equivalent. I said, good, because there isn't one. and so it's just these are the ones that I would recommend to people as potentially maybe the most fun. So 10 steampunk reads. Let me get something out of the way right away. From an academic perspective, H.G. Wells and Jules Verne are not the godfathers of steampunk. They are not steampunk writers. They are 19th century speculative fiction writers. Okay, so I will not include them in the list. Okay, I'm going to mention them a little bit here at the outset, then I'm going to just run away from them as quickly as I can. And the other reason that I do this is not only as an academic saying that this is not steampunk, because steampunk is a late 20th century, early 21st century phenomenon, but also because as someone who is an academic of science fiction in general, I don't want anybody appropriating these two gentlemen as their own. I don't want any subgroup grabbing Verne and Wells and going, they're ours! Precious, away from everybody else. Because if they're the grandfathers of anything, along with Mary Shelley as a grandmother potentially, they're of science fiction in general for the 20th and 21st century. So I don't like to limit that. Wells, as we know, War of the Worlds, and the Time Machine. And I've got George Powell's version of Time Machine up here because steampunk often, a lot of people who are into steampunk don't read steampunk. They don't read. That's something I've discovered going to con after con after con after con is, I remember interviewing James Blaylock, you're just going to show up in the slideshow here in just a little while, at SteamCon. And they put him in this ballroom. So we're in this massive room that could house hundreds. And I couldn't even say tens of nerds at the beginning. Because it was just this little, my sister and her daughter having attended to hang out with me, and then some really diehard Blaylock fans, and big empty room. And this is one of the guys who we can definitely chart as, in North America, the first steampunk writer. We can definitely chart that. and nobody's there. Why? Because a lot of people, when they say they like Verne, they like Wells, they like steampunk, they're talking about visual, talking about film or fashion, or they're talking about cosplay, they're talking about it in a way other than textual. So I wanted to also to mention that when people talk about Verne and Wells as progenitors of the steampunk look or the genre, or however someone describes it, once I dig a little bit further, I discover that what they're talking about is Harper Goff's Nautilus via the Disney 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, or they're talking about the design in George Pal's Time Machine. And then all of those great B movies from the 70s with, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but sort of that Land That Time Forgot kind of stuff. Verne, responsible for books like Around the World in 80 Days, Journey to the Center of the Earth, and of course 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And as I've already said, somebody says that they're a big fan of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, they're almost always referencing the Disney movie, and very rarely ever knowing anything about the text itself. And even when they know about the text, I'm not going to talk a ton about this right now, but maybe in the fall or perhaps later on today, we'll discuss why so many of us don't really know the story of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. That has to do with the fact that Verne was French and was translated by some really terrible translators at the turn of the century from the 19th to the 20th. But when we think of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, we almost always think of the Millennium Falcon of the 50s, Harper Goff's Nautilus. This was the ship, the cool ship. Right up, I remember in the 70s growing up, and it was still iconic. You see that, on LP versions of the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea story, and we think of that. And Greg Bear, great science fiction writer, said at the Eton Conference in 2009, he thinks this is where steampunk began. So he thinks, it was the Nautilus that designed that. What happens more often in steampunk reading, and here's my first actual recommendation to you guys, my first actual steampunk read to say this is something you should check out, is The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Most often what steampunk does with Wells or Verne is it grabs it, it appropriates it, doesn't think too hard about the social issues that both writers, it's a misconception, by the way, that Wells was the social guy and Verne was just all about the facts and figures. They're both very social in their writing. And Wells far more scientific than some people would give him credit for. But these 19th century texts are appropriated and then they're played with. And Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill's League of Extraordinary Gentlemen being one of the most famous iterations of this, but also one of the best, where you have sort of Victorian / steampunk Justice League of America. We're all jerks. That's Alan Moore, right? That's Alan Moore. Everybody's like, Alan Moore is brilliant, and I agree, but he is a one-trick pony in this regard. He thinks we're all monsters. He thinks the human race is absolutely debased. And he was referring to his characters. But we've got Captain Nemo here, Hyde, Invisible Man, Alan Quatermain, and Mina Murray from Dracula, and these forming a sort of early superhero team. I've got the second volume up because, for my money, I like this volume better than I like the first volume in the collected trades. You really should read the first one simply to know why the characters act the way they do and to get the build that Moore generates. There's some fantastic stuff here. I should also warn you, though, that it is Alan Moore, so reader warned, bad stuff will happen, and it's graphic. It's tough stuff, but he plays with the War of the Worlds and puts these characters in that storyline. And as someone who teaches that book regularly, I can say that both the writer and artist here do a brilliant job of putting you in Wells's story. And they do some really wonderful things with doing some twists. I can't even tell you about them because they're those. It's the M. Night Shyamalan moment that's going to come right at the end of the book, and you're like, no, wow, really? But you should know War of the Worlds ahead of time. And that perhaps is the reason that you should read Verne or Wells, is that when they're referenced in steampunk, most often it's worth your time to know the original text, to know whether or not the person you're reading sucks, because they are out there. There's a lot of them. There's some really bad steampunk that just grabs Verne or Wells and just plays with them at a perfectly surface level, which can be fun, but isn't particularly illuminating in any other way. Here's one of the other covers, one of the single issues. Since this year's Pure Spec Festival is called 20,000 Leagues Under the Spec. I wanted to say, if you're going to read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, you read this version. And if you don't, we'll have words. The completely restored and annotated edition, you have to grab it off Amazon. Indigo Chapters is not going to have it. And if you bid on the collected edition that we have over here, that's okay. It's a beautiful looking book. And as David Damrosch, comparative literature guru, said, it is better to read in translation than not to read at all. But those are some of the weak translations that you're going to find in that collected edition. This one is the best. In a very general way. There's another one that I like just for its readability. But this is annotated, has all this extra information, so you can just read your way through it and enjoy it. And then you can go back and you can unpack it and sort of have that second read, bringing to light the lie that's been perpetuated, especially in North America, that Verne is just a boy's adventure writer, that he didn't have anything deeper going on with his writing. Really, really great version. But if you don't want to read that much and you really like your books with pictures, then you should check out Gary Gianni's adaptation of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which is, bar none, the best visual adaptation that I've seen. The most true, I should say that. It's most true to Verne. He's just an absolutely gorgeous book, great big splash pages, and this is amazing because he was working with a very tight number of pages that he could utilize to translate Verne into the comic book medium, and yet he repeatedly creates these gigantic full-size splash pages to convey one moment that is crucial in Verne's story. So these really actually make good companion books to sort of sit side by side and ask yourself, why did Gary Gianni focus on that moment? And why is it pivotal? And you go back into Verne and you can take a look and try to unpack some of those things. But again, back to our steampunk side of things. What does steampunk do? Steampunk grabs Verne and it appropriates it and does something with it. One of the most enjoyable, and I have to say, surprisingly so, because I thought I was going to hate this book. I went in with a bad attitude. I went in thinking Kevin J. Anderson was doing everything to Verne that I didn't want him to do as a Verne scholar. And he doesn't. He just does some beautiful stuff. And I listen to most of my books because I can't read on the page when I'm in transit or in flight. And I was descending into Seattle for a SteamCon 2 years ago, listening to this book, and realized I was on the plane. You know those moments when you're reading and you completely lost yourself and you're in that world, you're in that story, and now my heart, genuinely, I'm not at all lying here. Kevin J. Anderson had broken my heart for the character of Nemo in this book. And so now I'm trying not to cry because the guy next to me is reading Men's Health and it's really, robust, and I'm trying very hard not to weep on the plane. And that caught me by surprise because I didn't think that was going to happen. Anderson's also responsible, you can see here in the background, for writing the novella that accompanied Rush's concept album, Clockwork Angels. And I haven't read it yet, so I can't recommend it. It's just simply to say that Kevin J. Anderson is playing in the steampunk world quite a bit. He's also done the same thing that he did with this book to Wells's War of the Worlds, but I haven't read it yet, so I can't recommend it.